Lena always said the beginning felt effortless, like slipping into a rhythm she hadn't known she was missing. Ryan appeared steady, attentive, the kind of man who could read a room and make it bend toward him. Their friends praised their chemistry, and she let herself believe the story, a partnership without fault lines. But beneath the smooth surface, tiny signals prick at her attention, soft enough to dismiss yet impossible to silence. The way his phone stayed face down. How he checked messages with a half smile and slid the device back before she could see. A sudden shift in tone whenever she entered the room, as if he'd been speaking a language he didn't want her to learn. At first she chalked it up to the stress of his job. He was often away on quick trips that couldn't quite be explained, deadlines that came and went without leaving traces of real work. She convinced herself that stability was built on trust, that doubt could rot a relationship faster than silence. Still, a thin tension gathered in her chest whenever he stepped out for late meetings. The unease stayed, even as he wrapped her in warmth at night and spoke about plans for the future. Love, she thought, should not feel like holding a secret you never asked for. Sam noticed the shift before Lena put words to it. Over coffee, her friend tilted her head, watching Lena stir sugar into an untouched cup. "You don't look happy anymore," Sam said gently. "It's like you're standing on tiptoe all the time." Lena smiled, brushed it off, but the remark lodged itself inside. She began observing with more precision the sudden detours in Ryan's stories, the way he sometimes seemed rehearsed. He had an answer ready for everything, yet something stayed unspoken behind his eyes. One evening, she caught a flash of a name lighting his screen before he swiped it away. Sophie. The syllables echoed in her head long after. She didn't recognize the name from his colleagues, and when she asked who Sophie was, he laughed it off, said she must have misread. It wasn't the laugh that unnerved her but how quickly it came, as if designed to close the subject. The next day, he left early without mentioning why. The gap between what he said and what she felt widened until it pressed against every quiet moment. She tried to remind herself of the man who once left handwritten notes in her bag, who remembered her smallest preferences. But those gestures had become sparse, replaced by mechanical compliments that landed with a hollow thud. She started to catalog inconsistencies, receipts from restaurants she'd never visited, faint traces of perfume not her own, an unfamiliar keychain wedged in the car console. Each detail alone might have been harmless, yet together they formed a pattern she couldn't ignore. Nights stretched long as she lay awake, scrolling through her mind for proof she wasn't inventing stories. She hated the version of herself that dissected every movement, but an inner voice insisted there was more beneath his practice calm. Her thoughts ran in tight circles. Was she paranoid, or had she simply refused to see what was plain? The more she questioned, the clearer her answer felt, though clarity brought no comfort. One afternoon, while Ryan was away, she found herself standing in the middle of their living room, surrounded by stillness. Sunlight pulled across the floor, highlighting a silence that suddenly felt heavy, charged. She realized she had been living in a waiting room of her own making, holding out for reassurance he never truly offered. She didn't yet know the size of the truth or how deep the cracks ran, but she sensed the shape of betrayal crouched just beyond the doorway of her life. Patient and deliberate, Lena decided she could no longer drift through the haze. She would stop swallowing questions and start gathering facts, even if the answers undid everything they had built. The thought left a cold streak of fear, but also a fragile pulse of resolve. Whatever Ryan was hiding, she owed herself the certainty of knowing. Lena woke the next morning with the kind of stillness that comes after a storm, the air inside her finally free of the static that had kept her awake for months. She no longer needed to rehearse conversations or measure his tone for hidden meaning. The truth had settled, blunt and solid, and there was no space left for bargaining. She sat at the edge of the bed, letting the quiet stretch, feeling both fragile and strangely unburdened. What remained was a choice: continue orbiting Ryan's chaos or reclaim the life she had let drift while guarding his secrets. She began by tracing the shape of her own reflection, not the one Ryan had crafted through praise or manipulation. Memories flickered, times she had cancelled plans to soothe his moods, moments she had shrunk to keep their peace intact. She saw how carefully she had curated herself, trying to stay worthy of a love that was never whole. The shame of that recognition was sharp, yet underneath it lay a steadier force. She was done negotiating with someone who treated devotion as a puzzle to be solved through deception. Sam's voice echoed from their last conversation, urging her to see freedom rather than failure. She called her friend, words spilling out in an even tone that surprised them both. Sam didn't offer pity, only quiet affirmation that Lena's clarity mattered more than salvaging what was already hollow. That affirmation became a small anchor as she moved through the day, sorting through belongings with deliberate hands. She gathered the notes Ryan had once left, photographs from trips built on half-truths, trinkets meant to bind her to a story that no longer existed. Each item felt lighter as she placed it aside, no longer symbols of affection but evidence of a theater she had unknowingly joined. When Ryan tried to reach her, messages layered with apologies and urgency, she didn't rush to answer. She read them as statements, not invitations. They spoke of regret but lacked understanding, circling his fear of exposure rather than the harm he had inflicted. For the first time, she saw his need for control clearly. Every plea was about preserving access, not repairing what he had broken. She realized forgiveness would only reset the cycle, granting him space to rebuild the same architecture with new corners hidden from sight. Evenings became moments of quiet audit. She replayed conversations with fresh ears, noting how often he had shaped reality to fit his narrative. There had been warnings disguised as compliments, careful flattery meant to redirect questions. She felt no urge to catalog every betrayal. The broad shape was enough. The women were not rivals now but signposts pointing to a truth about him, an emptiness he tried to fill with conquest, a hunger that had nothing to do with her worth. Recognizing that distinction softened the rawest edges of hurt. One night she drafted a single message, each word chosen with care. She thanked him for the parts of their history that had been genuine, acknowledged the damage he had done, and stated simply that she would not participate in a story written on falsehood. There would be no drawn-out debate or staged reconciliation, only the clarity of departure. Hitting send felt less like ending something than reclaiming a voice she had muted with distance. She noticed how space in her home changed. Rooms once heavy with tension now invited breath. She rearranged furniture, opened curtains, let light carve new shapes across the floor. These gestures were not about erasing the past but establishing a boundary. She was present for herself now, not a supporting role in someone else's performance. Each small decision stitched confidence back into place. Days later, she stood by the window watching morning stretch over the street, the world moving forward without ceremony. Ryan's name no longer pulsed through her thoughts. It rested quietly in the background, stripped of power. What remained was her own steadiness, earned through pain but intact. She understood that closure was not an event offered by another but a line drawn inside. She had chosen to step beyond the reach of explanations, to honor the self that had questioned, endured, and finally acted. She didn't need a grand declaration or proof of vindication. The act of walking away, of refusing to shrink for someone else's convenience, was enough. The betrayal that once threatened to define her had become a reference point, a reminder of what she would no longer accept. As she turned from the window, sunlight trailing behind, she felt the shape of her life expanding, built now on ground that was fully her own. Lena's resolve hardened into a quiet plan, and the first proof arrived sooner than she expected. Ryan's phone, left behind in his rush to a supposed meeting, vibrated across the counter. She hesitated only a breath before opening the screen. A string of names filled the messages: Sophie, Amira, Chloe, Marin, Isla. Each thread carried words that twisted her stomach, small jokes, tender remarks, fragments of intimacy that belonged nowhere near their life together. One message stood out, a photograph paired with a line about the night before. Her pulse hammered as she scrolled, seeing how carefully he had divided himself, tailoring charm to fit every woman. What had looked like confidence was strategy, every gesture rehearsed, every compliment recycled. She copied enough evidence to erase any doubt, then sat still, holding the phone like an artifact from a world she hadn't known she lived in. Anger came first, scorching and precise, but underneath it a hollow disappointment spread. She had wanted to be wrong, to find an explanation that made her suspicion ridiculous. Instead, the truth was meticulous, a network arranged to keep her soothed while he fed appetites she hadn't imagined. It wasn't one slip or even two, it was an entire architecture of betrayal, assembled piece by piece. While she tried to preserve trust, Sophie surfaced again in the proof, bold and careless. A message about a weekend that never existed, casual references to gifts Lena had never seen. Sophie spoke as if possession were shared, not stolen, and the tone suggested she believed herself singular. Amira, by contrast, appeared in gentle lines, almost apologetic even in text. She described evenings that overlapped with Lena's memories, making it clear Ryan had perfected the art of doubling time. The others, Chloe, Marin, Isla, offered smaller windows, but together they formed a map of his constant calculation. Lena invited Amira to meet, needing a voice outside her own spiraling thoughts. Over coffee, Amira arrived with wary eyes, fingers tight around her cup. She admitted she had been seeing Ryan for months, that he spoke of obligations preventing public appearances. She confessed she had sensed there were others but never wanted to confirm it. "We all thought we were the only one," Amira said, voice steady despite the weight of the words. Lena felt an odd solidarity in the confession, a recognition of how thoroughly they had been played against each other. That night, Ryan walked in as if nothing had shifted, greeting her with the same easy warmth. She watched him move through their space, realizing every familiar gesture was also a cover. When she laid the phone on the table, his smile flickered, then returned, thinner now. He reached for explanations, pressure, temptation, and insistence that he had only wanted to keep pace with her, to meet her expectations. He spoke of being trapped by a need to be everything at once, as though deceit were an act of devotion. The justifications stumbled out, but they landed flat, stripped of charm by the clarity of evidence. She listened without interrupting, absorbing the language of someone caught yet unwilling to surrender the myth of control. He described the other women as diversions, necessary outlets so he could remain steady with her. The arrogance of it stunned her more than the details. He believed his effort to balance lives was proof of commitment, that exhaustion from his elaborate scheme somehow honored their bond. It was an admission framed as sacrifice, a confession warped into praise for himself. When silence finally closed over his words, Lena felt the room tilt. She wasn't shouting or crying, only watching the last illusions dissolve. The man who once traced her palm like it held secrets had engineered a rotating cast to keep her convinced of his loyalty. It wasn't passion that drove him but calculation, a compulsion to orchestrate satisfaction as if love were an equation demanding multiple variables. She saw, with a strange calm, that his betrayals had never been about her shortcomings. They were about appetite, entitlement, and a refusal to choose a single truth. He asked if she could forgive, if they might start fresh, but the request sounded mechanical, detached from real remorse. She realized he feared losing the stability she offered, not the harm he had caused. For Lena, the damage was complete. Yet there was also an unexpected steadiness in knowing the full scope. The unknown had been worse than the reality. Now she could stop doubting herself. As Ryan waited for her answer, she felt the first quiet draft of distance slide between them, an invisible line that would not be crossed again.